Good day, students. Dr. O'Malley checking in once again for the second, actually the third of our YouTube postings in 20th century Irish history. I do want to thank those of you who responded to me. You will have received or should be receiving a number of outlines from the Easter Rising through the War of Independence to this presentation on the treaty and the Civil War. A further outline on the Cosgrave years, and finally the outline on the ascendancy of De Valera to 1948. Unfortunately, I will not be able to post on this YouTube anything beside myself lecturing, but if you will go to Sakai, you should be able to reach in fullness each of the PowerPoints that cover the topics that I have taken up and will continue to take up. Today, again, the appropriate PowerPoint will be the treaty and the Civil War. Secondly, posted also, as you know, are the assignments for this coming week, March 23rd, March 25th, March 27th, centering around this lecture on the treaty and the Civil War. The assignments, which I will reiterate at the end of this lecture, are specific and quite manageable. Already one of you has sent me in the beginning of the assignments, fulfillment of the assignments of the first, associated with the first lecture. That being said, I also did attach, send with the outlines supportive of the materials, so you would want to consult those, and I will, in the course of my lectures, reference some of that material as well. In this particular lecture, especially important is the text of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. So, let's begin. Treaty and the Civil War. I quote, "When you have sweated, toiled, had mad dreams, hopeless nightmares, you find yourself in London streets, cold and dank in the night air, think what I have done for Ireland, something which she has wanted these past 500-700 years. Will anyone be satisfied at the bargain? Will anyone, I tell you, early this morning I signed my death warrant. I thought at the time, how odd, ridiculous, a bullet might just as well have done the job 5 years ago. But these signatures are the first real step for Ireland, if people will only remember that first real step." I've just quoted the words of Michael Collins in a letter to his friend John O'Kane at the time of Collins' approval, along with the members of the Dail delegation, of the treaty. But anyway, before December 6th, 1921, let us go back to earlier in the year, to the developments in the aftermath of the truce of July 11th, 1921. There were at first negotiations by heads of government. That is to say, 2 days after the truce, De Valera met with Lloyd George. De Valera opposed any Northern Irish government participation in the truce, post-truce talks. And Lloyd George's bargaining position was shaped by imperial pressures. That is to say, Lloyd George's bargaining position was this: Ireland must remain within the British Empire, and Northern Ireland must not be disestablished against the will of the Unionist majority. As for De Valera, he wanted and demanded in those first meetings Irish independence. Now, in those first negotiations, I want to cite the specifics of Lloyd George's initial proposals. Ireland, he offered, would be a commonwealth dominion with certain conditions attached: naval and air access for the British in Ireland, no protective tariffs, partial payment of the British war debt, and again, Northern Ireland to remain untouched. Now, Lloyd George is making these proposals to De Valera, who was heading a second Dail that was more militant after the August 1921 session. For example, the title of the leadership of the second Dail changed in the August 1921 sessions. De Valera was no longer simply president of Dáil Éireann, he was president of the Irish Republic. And an oath of allegiance to the Irish Republic was made, absolutely necessary for members of the Dáil. At that time, the cabinet consisted of De Valera as president, Arthur Griffith as Minister for Foreign Affairs, Michael Collins, still a Finance Minister, Austin Stack as Home Affairs Minister, and still Cahill Brewer as Defense Minister, William Cosgrave, Local Government Minister, and Barton as Minister for Economic Affairs. In September of 1921, in that communication to Lloyd George, De Valera offered his version, if you will, of advanced autonomy. He called it, and you should know this term, external association. What did he mean by it? Ireland would not be part of the British Empire, but would be closely linked with the British Empire by a special alliance. This was not acceptable to Lloyd George, who proposed a meeting not of just himself and De Valera. Rather, he proposed a meeting of delegations from his administration, the Westminster government, and the Dail. When would that take place? And where? In London, and begin on October 11, 1921. And indeed, that did happen. And so we have the second phase of negotiations. Negotiation by delegations, which extended over a period in the months of October, November, and early December of 1921. Now, who would make up the Dail delegation? 3 cabinet ministers, Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, and Robert Barton. 2 legal experts, Eamon Duggan, George Gavin Duffy, and a secretary, Protestant, interestingly enough, Erskine Childers, the old Anglo-Saxon's cousin of Barton. Now, you notice who wasn't in the delegation. De Valera. The delegation was weakened by De Valera's decision not to participate. He resisted efforts of his colleagues that he should head the delegation. What were De Valera's justification for not going? He said he was head of state. The British public viewed him as an extremist. And if he stayed in Dublin, he could win hardliners like Carl Brewer and Austin Stack to external association. It should be noted, however, that De Valera did appreciate Lloyd George's uncanny ability to confuse and to manipulate opponents. Now, before the delegation left for London, the Dail delegation, it did receive instructions. The delegates were styled, they were accredited as, quote, envoys plenipotentiary. Nevertheless, any decisions they made in London were to be referred back to Dublin, presumably for final approval by De Valera in Dublin. There were no, in the instructions, there were no detailed directions as to terms other than the delegates were told, if you have to break off the talks, break on Ulster. In other words, break off the talks because you weren't satisfied with the provisions for Northern Ireland. Now, who are the members, by the way, of the royal delegation? British delegation was made up of professional politicians. Winston Churchill, Secretary of State for War. Austen Chamberlain, Lord Birkenhead, 2 conservative politicians. Worthington Evans, also a key career politician. Hammer Greenwood, former Chief Secretary for Ireland, and Hewitt, the Attorney General. These were seasoned professional politicians who made up the delegation headed up by the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, facing off against the not particularly seasoned delegates of the Dail. Now, the sessions were developed as follows. There were full plenary sessions, delegation squaring off against full delegation. From over the days October 11th to October 24th, the issues that were brought up were, one, the constitutional status of Ireland; secondly, the actual division of Ireland between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland; and the third issue, British security and defense requirements in Ireland. Interestingly enough, that issue of British security and defense requirements in Ireland were settled speedily. Erskine Childers had some misgivings about those, and we'll mention those security provisions as this lecture unfolds. Now, what about the Ulster question, partition? Lloyd George removed the Ulster question as a problem for himself and for both sides. For immediate solution, he sold Arthur Griffith with a promise of a boundary commission and a pledge to pressure Craig and the Ulster Unionists. What do we mean by a boundary commission? Well, if the delegations couldn't come up with a resolution of the boundary, the Ulster question, Northern Ireland, then there would be a commission set up to separate, create a final boundary between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland that presumably would result in a kind of pressure on the Northern Ireland government to make significant concessions to the government in Dublin. Lloyd George also got Collins to accept the idea of a boundary commission in the treaty. What did this all mean, this maneuvering by Lloyd George? It meant that the Irish delegation, the Dail delegation, would have no chance to break on the Ulster question. Now, what about the first issue and the real solid issue, singular issue, the constitutional status of Ireland? David Lloyd George rejected Griffith's October 24th proposal of external association. And as the delegations met, a mutually acceptable compromise on constitutional status could not be worked out. The British offered a modified oath of allegiance because that was definitely a sticking point. but the Irish really didn't back down. They offered a further formula for external association. So the two delegations were unable to find a middle ground on the question of the constitutional status of Ireland. And on December 3rd, the Dail delegation returned to Dublin, or at least on December 3rd, they returned to Dublin, and at least on December 3rd, the Dail cabinet discussed the constitutional question. De Valera ordered rejection of David Lloyd George's oath of allegiance. The delegation proposed a new form of the oath which Lloyd George dismissed as a reinstatement of external association. This is when the Dail delegation went back to London. Finally, David Lloyd George issued an ultimatum on December 5th to the weary Irish delegation: accept the articles of agreement that his government had put together, or there would be war. An ultimatum: either accept the articles of agreement that his government would accept, or he would unleash war on the Dail and on Dail revolutionary forces within 3 days. The Dail delegation backed off. They all accepted the articles of agreement, believing that the British had reached the limits of their concessions and that they had saved Ireland from a terrible war. Now, a singular question that has always hovered over the developments of December 5th, December 6th. Was Lloyd George bluffing? If the Dail delegation hadn't accepted the Articles of Agreement, signed on to them, would he have unleashed a terrible war? It's one of those what-ifs in history, and what I simply would say is it never came to that. But what did happen was that Collins and Griffiths, the other members of the Dail delegation, signed their names to the Articles of Agreement early on December 6th. Right, get that name down. December 6th, 1921. Those Articles of Agreement for a treaty between Great Britain and Ireland, again, were signed at 2:10 a.m. on December 6, 1921. They're simply known in shortened form as the Anglo-Irish Treaty, or in even shorter form as the treaty. And I'm going to refer to it henceforth in this lecture as the treaty. Now, you have a copy before you in the attachment that I sent in hard copy to your home your mailing address. It's the very first part of that attachment, and it's simply headlined in all of its details as the treaty. The treaty. Now, what's in the treaty? The status of Ireland was defined in Articles 1 through 4. The Irish Free State, as it was called in the treaty, would be a dominion. And its status in relationship to the government of Britain, the United Kingdom really, would be similar to the relationship at the time between Canada and the United Kingdom government. There would also be a Governor General appointed by the Crown for the Irish Free State. Legislation passed by the legislature of the Irish Free State would have to be signed off by the Governor General, but that would, as it was in Canada, would be automatic, practically automatic. But there was a real problem, as it turned out, for those who opposed the treaty, and that was the Oath of Allegiance. And I quote the Oath of Allegiance from Article 4. The members of the Parliament of the Irish Free State had to take the oath as follows. I, fill in the name, do solemnly swear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State as by law established, and that I will be faithful to His Majesty King George V, his heirs and successors by law, in virtue of the common citizenship of Ireland with Great Britain and her adherence to and membership of the group of nations forming the British Commonwealth of Nations. Notice that the oath primarily requires the member of the Parliament of the Irish Free State to at first pledge true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State, and then to be faithful to the King. That, as we're going to find out, did not settle, did not satisfy treaty opponents. Secondly, on the matter of defense, Article 7 in the matter of defense gave Britain full harbor facilities in Queenstown, in the vicinity of Dublin, in Bearhaven, Cork, Lough Swilly, at the border between Derry, Londonderry, and Donegal. When would those facilities be granted? In a time of peace, the British government would have harbour and other facilities, which I just mentioned at Queenstown. I should say. Let me clarify the the places. Queenstown is not in the vicinity of Dublin. Queenstown is basically the port of Cork City. So Queenstown, Bearhaven, County Cork, Lough Swilly, in the port in the borderland between Donegal and Londonderry. So Queenstown, Bearhaven, Lough Swilly. Now, in wartime, those harbor facilities could be expanded beyond those three ports. In wartime, the British would be granted any other facilities in Ireland that they thought necessary. And in the matter of defense, in the treaty, Britain would be responsible for Ireland's coastal defense, not permanently, but for the next 5 years. So, defense. What about Northern Ireland? Articles 11 through 15 dealt with the relationship between the two parts of Ireland. That is, between Northern Ireland, 6 counties that fell under the Northern Ireland statelets set up by the Government of Ireland Act, and the Irish Free State government to be set up to govern the other 26 counties. The important thing about the provision for Northern Ireland, if you go through those articles, you find that they enable the Parliament of Northern Ireland to opt out of inclusion under the government of the Irish Free State and remain a separate, a part of the United Kingdom with its own subordinate parliament. And that those articles also provided for the Boundary Commission to be assembled that would work out a permanent boundary between Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State if the Northern Ireland Parliament refused to accept inclusion in the Irish Free State. That was a treaty. It wouldn't go into effect on either side of the Irish Sea until it was approved by the two parliamentary bodies. What happened in the Dail? There was a treaty debate. It lasted for several days, off and on, in December 1921 and January 1922. It should be noted that the general public in Ireland, for the most part, welcomed the treaty. But the politicians were split. December 8th, the Dail cabinet split down the middle. And one has to ask, well, what about De Valera? December 14th, De Valera recommended rejection of the treaty. And then the treaty was debated by the full Dail Éireann on December 4th, from December 14th to 1921 to January 10th, 1922, off and on. Now, what can we say about the Dail debates on the treaty? Northern Ireland was scarcely mentioned. A real sticking point, especially for opponents of the treaty, was Ireland's relationship in it to the empire, especially the Oath of Allegiance. Now, let's kind of summarize the arguments that were mustered by the two sides in the Dail debate. Those who argued for the treaties made the following points. A compromise, it was necessary. And it has good points. British forces would leave Ireland. Ireland would be, the Irish Free State, Irishmen would control their own affairs. Dominion status had its advantages. For example, as a member of the British Commonwealth, the Irish Free State would have access to some sizable areas that constituted the Commonwealth, trade-wise, for example. Collins' principal argument was, look, it's not perfect. It's a stepping stone. And it's it would consider it a stepping stone to an all-out independence for Ireland. And the proponents of the treaty said, look, Lloyd George had made real concessions. Now, what about the anti-treaty arguments? They broke down into two camps. There were the anti-imperialists who rejected the treaty, but they focused on de Valera's document number 2, which sought this relationship. What would document number 2? It provided that Ireland would be, the Irish Free State would be separate from the United Kingdom, from Britain, but the Irish Free State would be connected with the United Kingdom, actually with the British Empire through an alliance. So these were the so-called anti-imperialists. The more doctrinaire Republicans, they were hardliners. They were more intractable than the anti-imperialists. For them, war was preferable to dishonor. And who were some of the folks who took that position? Austin Stack, for example. Well, how did the Dail vote? It should be noted that its vote was very much influenced by the fact that the Catholic bishops favored the treaty. The Irish press, major Irish, many minor Irish newspapers favored the treaty. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, secret organization headed up by Collins, favored the treaty. No doubt in deference to Mick, the big fellow. There was a final week of debate, January 3rd through 7th. 1922 was a bitter debate. People were emotional and near tears, some of them. The actual vote on the treaty occurred on January 7th, 1922. The treaty was approved, certainly not overwhelmingly. It was approved 64 votes in favor, 57 opposed. January 9th, De Valera, 1922, De Valera resigned as president of the Dail, really president of the Irish Republic. Griffith replaced him. A new cabinet was formed. The Republic was kept in place as a temporary measure. De Valera and the anti-treaty deputies withdrew from the Dail. Now, did civil war immediately erupt between anti and pro-treaty forces? No. Indeed, on January 14th, the Parliament of Southern Ireland met on January 14th, set up a provisional government for the Irish Free State. Collins was chosen as chairman. Simultaneously, the Dail government was kept in place, headed up by Griffith. But the membership of the two bodies overlapped, and the government that counted was the provisional government set up on January 14th, headed up initially by Collins as chairman. Now, what were the problems of the provisional government? One was, how do you finance the new Irish Free State? The British House of Commons appropriated £500,000 to the new Free State, but it was beginning its birth in troubled economic times. Not surprisingly, so many parts of the post-World War I period were being buffeted in economic waters. Unemployment was a serious problem in the Free State. But nevertheless, the Dublin Castle, the British government in Ireland, ceased to exist. Its authority was handed over to the provisional government of the Irish Free State on January 16th. The provisional government quickly organized a police force. The Civil Guards, as they were called, replaced the Royal Irish Constabulary. They were initially set up as an unarmed national police body. The Free State provisional government continued much of the British system of government, but the matter that counted most as the provisional government went forward in the first half of 1922 was the question of law and order. How would the provisional government deal with the dissidents who refused to recognize the Free State provisional government? That question, the one part of the answer was, to state who in critical organizations supported the treaty and those who opposed it. The IRA, for example, the Irish Republican Army, it was split on the treaty. In what direction? Well, perhaps 3/4 of the IRA as it existed at the time of that the treaty was signed and at the time that the Free State was organized, 3/4 were opposed. Many brigade commandants of the IRA were against the treaty. Tom Barry, Liam Lynch, the inimitable, skilled, great writer, intellectual, Ernie O'Malley. They were all against the treaty. Indeed, the anti-treaty IRA held an army convention on March 26, 1922, even though they were forbidden to do so by Defense Minister in the Provisional Government, Richard Mulcahy. The convention set up its own executive government, which was styled in the press and in common conversation as the Irregulars. They were not only called Irregulars, but referred to, I think appropriately, as Republicans. And what about those loyal to the provisional government of the Irish Free State? When it came to military organizations, those IRA who supported the treaty were known, they segued into what would become known in common conversation as the National Army, or even more conversationally as the Free Staters. Now, other developments. Even before the convention, the anti-treaty IRA Army Convention. On February 21st, 1922, Sinn Féin, the party, held an Ard Fèis, which was, a party convention, attended by both factions, pro-treaty, anti-treaty. They agreed that no general election would be held until the voters of Ireland, of the Irish Free State, could examine the draft constitution that would be set up by the Free State government. But by this time, De Valera, who walked out of the Dail, he's touring the Irish countryside and saying some inflammatory things. I quote here, "There are things stronger than parliamentary majorities." He's in effect saying, so even if the Dail approved the treaty, we don't have to accept it. And in the meantime, local IRA units were taking over, anti-treaty IRA units were taking over barracks and a military post vacated by the British. Or they were, and in some instances, they were taking them over by force. Ernie O'Malley, for example, raided the Royal Irish Constabulary barracks at Clonmel, County Tipperary, on February 26, 1922. By March of 1922, the relatively large British Army barracks there was divided into three parts, one section of the barracks was occupied by members of the National Army, the Free State Army, another segment by anti-treaty IRA, and there were still some British regulars who were in the process of vacating. There are a lot of conflicting developments occurring, as I say, in the first half of 1922. What about the situation in Northern Ireland? There's considerable sectarian strife, conflict between the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force that had been set up there as a successor to the Royal Irish Constabulary. And there were police reserves who were particularly violent, the B Specials. The Royal Irish Constabulary and the B Specials squared off in violent conflict between the IRA in the 6 counties. To be sure, Craig and Collins had some meetings and crafted some tentative agreements in January and March, but they did not. No real bridges were built between the newly created Free State and the already existing Northern Ireland government. It should be noted that Sir Henry Wilson was serving by this time as military advisor to the Northern government. You'll see why I make that point in a moment. And interestingly enough, De Valera surreptitiously, secretly, was supplying arms, at least in Ulster, in the 6 counties, to the anti-treaty IRA. More than anything, though, Dev was trying to fend off war. He didn't want to go into a civil war against those he had been so close to. He tried to bring peace between the anti-treaty and pro-treaty factions. But the irregulars, the Republicans, were belligerent. For example, anti-treatyites, irregulars, anti-treaty IRA, led by Rory O'Connell, occupied the heart of the Irish judiciary in the Free State, the 4 courts in Dublin, on April 14, 1922. Collins made no move to oust them. In the meantime, Collins and Griffith drafted a constitution to please the Republicans. Lloyd George rejected it. On May 20th, 1922, Collins and De Valera signed a pact that all candidates for the 3rd Dail would stand on the Sinn Féin ticket. That is to say, the Dail to be elected for the Irish Free State. The number allowed to each side would be in exactly the same proportion to its existing strength in the Dail, which meant in effect that when they had an election to choose the 3rd Dail, if the pact would be abided by, it really wouldn't be an authentic election. In the meantime, outbreaks of violence were more frequent throughout the country. Irregulars were attacking, in some parts of the Free State, prominent landowners, Protestant Unionists, and there were many disorders. Nevertheless, general election was held on June 16th, 1922. Its result was announced on June 24th, 1922. And it's essentially an election for a Dail, a third Dail, for the, at least the, in this case, the Irish Free State. The results were as follows. Pro-treaty Sinn Féin, 58 votes. Anti-treaty Sinn Féin, 38 seats. Labour, the Irish Labour Party, 17 seats. The Farmers' Party, 7 seats. 7 independents, and 4 ex-unionists. Now, if we take and add up those Dail members who were elected in that general election of June 16, 1922, the pro-treaty prevailed, clearly. Votes, individual votes. Pro-treaty Sinn Féin got, deputies got 239,000. Anti-treaty Sinn Féin, 134,000. Other deputies representing parties other than Sinn Féin, 247,000. What does this all add up to? This is critical. This is critical. So the election outcome showed that support for the treaty among the voters, the electorate of the Irish Free State, was very great. Indeed, 2/5 of the voters didn't consider the treaty settlement the dominant issue in Irish politics. That being said, the outcome of the treaty, outcome of the election of June 16, 1922, did not prevent the outbreak of war. Indeed, it erupted within a few days, a few weeks. June 22nd, 1922, the military advisor to the Northern Ireland government was assassinated on his doorstep in England, Sir Henry Wilson, by 2 IRA men. They had been given that mission by Collins. This was previously, before the truce of July. Nevertheless, they carried it out. That catalyzed a firm British government response. The British government issued an ultimatum to the provisional government of the Free State, Collins government. The government was ordered to, in other words, crush the irregulars, insurgents, and what, by the way, also moved Collins and his government to action against the irregulars was the seizure by the Four Courts garrison of Free State General O'Connell on June 27, 1922. Enough was enough. Within a few days, the Four Courts, which was occupied by the Republican irregulars, was shelled by by artillery provided to the Free State by the British government, and the Four Courts fell. But that shelling signaled the opening round of the Irish Civil War. Late June, early July, it got underway. Let's reflect on the coming of the Civil War under the heading of causes of the Civil War. I would argue the following. The coming of the Civil War between treaty and anti-treaty Irish was not the inevitable consequence of the split in the Dail. It was not caused by the partition of Northern Ireland from the Irish Free State. Neither side was interested in social and economic reform. And the Civil War was not directly caused by De Valera. But, well, you say, well, what were the real causes of the Civil War? I would say the basic cause, the underlying cause, was Ireland's continued connection in a subordinate position with Great Britain as expressed in the Oath of Allegiance. The real stumbling block for the anti-treaty forces was that Oath of Allegiance, that abomination as they saw it, the Oath of Allegiance. There were proximate causes. There was a split in the IRA that never fully recovered. The IRA was never fully placed under control, even before the treaty of the Dail government. And the other proximate causes, defiant actions by the irregulars, the IRA, the anti-treaty IRA. We've already noted the establishment of an irregular executive, the seizure of the Four Courts. These are proximate causes that are bringing on the prospect of a civil war. What about immediate causes? I would say the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson and the capture of General O'Connell. So the Civil War. Late June until May of late June 1922 until May of 1923. Let's divide it into periods.
Over 63 minutes.
63. Okay. We have the Civil War lasting from June to May of 1923. There's the Republican Rising that lasts from June 28th to July 5th, 1922. The Four Courts fell. There was fighting in O'Connell Street, like Easter week. Carl Brewer died there. There was a second phase, the fall of the Munster Republic in July and August. The chief of staff of the irregulars was Liam Lynch. The Free State forces had field weapons. The Army's strength was rapidly built up to 60,000. Limerick fell on July 20th, Waterford on July 21st. Early August, troops were deployed by the Free State government by sea. Cork was captured on August 12th. By the end of August, all the major towns in Munster were in Free State hands. But August also saw the death of Griffith by CVA, cerebral vascular episode, August 12th, and then August 22nd, Collins was shot in his home area of West Cork, going there in an effort to bring an end to the violence. From September of 1922 to May of 1923, the guerrillas were in retreat. The Republicans employed a guerrilla warfare, but they didn't enjoy the sympathy of the rural community, and the Free Staters were headed up by seasoned guerrillas from the War from Independence who knew local terrains. The third Dail convened on September 9th, 1922. It's headed up as president by William Cosgrave and as the second in command by Kevin O'Neill. They brought in the Emergency Powers Act. A number of Republicans were executed, including Erskine Childers. The National Army mercilessly hunted down Republicans. By the end of 1922, over 12,000 anti-Free Staters were interned. There were assassinations of some Free State officials, Sean Hales, December 7th, by the irregulars. And in retribution, the Free State government executed on December 8th, 1922, Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows. The Republican government's politicians elected their own government with Dail as president in October 1922, but the real hand power was in the hands of Liam Lynch in County Waterford. He's killed in action on April 10th. He's succeeded by Frank Aiken as Chief of Staff of the IRA. In May 24th, 1923, Dail proclaimed, issued a proclamation, Legion of the Rearguard. In effect, it's an order by Dail and Frank Aiken to stop fighting. Republicans stopped fighting, hid their arms, went on the run. The effects of the Civil War, we can say that no one really won, although it did confirm the authority of the Free State government. It was a terrible waste of leadership and talent. There was a spiritual cost, a psychological wound to the whole nation. How many died? Well, it's much debated. It was said, up until a few years ago, around 600. But it's clear that more than that died. The unity of Sinn Féin was shattered, and the Civil War added to the already challenges associated with new beginnings for the Irish Free State. So the problem: economic recession, grave social problems, heavy government debt, and the question, law and order question, that is to say, having laid down not given up their arms, but hid their arms, what would the anti-treaty IRA, the irregulars, the anti-treaty organization do in the years and decades that followed? Enough said. I want you to go through carefully the PowerPoint and have at your side the outline and read carefully the attachment. And finally, I reiterate what's already posted, the assignments for the March 23rd, March 25th, March 27th days. You're to produce a detailed one-page outline of Gibney 199 to 205. It's a few pages in the textbook, principal textbook. You're also to produce a detailed half-page outline of the PowerPoint on the treaty and the Civil War, 1921-1923. And then I want you to produce a thoughtful one-page response to the following question. Having read McGivney, having listened to the lecture, having scoured the outline, and the attachment, the hard copy attachments to it. Answer the question in one page. Was the Civil War launched by the anti-treaty IRA, the irregulars, justified? I thank you, and I look forward to for next week's coverage to producing another YouTube that would focus on the history of the 10 years of the Cosgrave government. In the meantime, please abide by the leadership of both federal and state and local as we try to contain and ultimately diminish the horrendous pandemic associated with the virus. Again, my prayers for you. God be with you. And I know that I'm confident that the good Lord in His divine providence will produce an outcome that we can live with. God bless. To your Dr. O'Malley.